And we do that just so that if people can't attend, we can have that available for people to go back and watch. This is important information and open to the public. So if that bothers you and you do have a question, just feel free to throw your question into the chat. And that's totally fine. And we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to put the...
Okay, I'm on mute now.
I'm going to put some things in the chat here. This is where you can find the recordings. I'll also throw it in the chat at the end as well. Here's my email also. And so, okay, so I'd like to start by just thanking everybody for being here today. We're going to be welcoming back Erika Rhett Hunt again from Pierce County. Erika is going to be building from her previous presentation regarding Pierce County's allocation targets. This time she's going to be going into a little bit greater detail on how the county plans to meet 1220, HB 1220, and HB 1110 ahead of the 2024 periodic update. If you missed the presentations on those bills, you can go back and watch those on our YouTube channel as well. That link that I just gave you in the chat. And if you haven't already, I encourage you to go ahead and sign up for our newsletter. That's where you're going to opt in to receiving updates, upcoming events, important information about affordable housing, and definitely all the invites for these events. And just a little bit about who we are. So my name is Casey Twiggs, and I'm the membership coordinator for the Tacoma-Pierce County Affordable Housing Consortium. We are a nonprofit membership-based agency, and we provide public education and advocacy for the expansion of affordable housing in Pierce County. We do this by educating the public on the need for affordable housing, by hosting webinars, meetings, and collecting data to share with the public. Additionally, we also advocate at the state and local levels for policies and funding that support the creation of new affordable housing. And we have about 60 members from affordable housing developers, financiers, construction companies, architects, and consultants, as well as individual advocates who are all dedicated to advancing affordable housing in Pierce County. If you'd like to learn more about what we do as an organization or how to become a member or anything, just additional information, feel free to email me. My email is in the chat. And with that, I'd like to introduce our presenter today. Erika Rhett Hunt is the long-range planning supervisor for Pierce County. She has more than 2 decades of experience in comprehensive planning, public education, public engagement, and housing, with experience in shoreline planning, environmental review, community needs assessments, rural lands, and neighborhood redevelopment. Outside of work, you might find her enjoying a nice walk, cheering on the Seattle Sounders and OL Reign, boating with friends and family, or playing board games and card games. We are very grateful to have her back again today. And just before we get started, a little bit of minor housekeeping. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to type them in the chat or raise your hand, and we can pause for questions along the way, or just wait until the very end. We'll have plenty of time for question, answers, and discussion at the end. And we do ask if you come off, if you would come off of turn your camera on rather, when you do ask your question, trying to encourage more of a discussion. It's nice to see your face if we can. And with that, I'm going to pass it along to Erika.
Yes. There we go. Thank you so much, Casey. Really appreciate it. I'm Erika Rhett Hunt, and thank you for that great introduction. I really appreciate that the consortium has asked me to come talk about our plans to update our Pierce County comprehensive plan and our approaches to meeting new state requirements for housing. So I think this is really important to our entire community, and is an issue that's been on lots of people's minds. So I know that this series has included other discussions of the changes that have been happening at the state level to support planning for housing. But just because this particular part is so important to our discussion, I want to make sure that I do a brief overview so that we are all on the same page. So the Growth Management Act, or GMA, as planners refer to it, requires communities to prepare comprehensive plans that plan for 20 years of projected growth. Now, housing has always been a required part of our comprehensive plans. Communities were required to analyze housing needs and set policies to encourage affordable housing. But in 2021, the requirements changed to add more planning requirements. For the first time, the Washington State Department of Commerce was given responsibility to identify the housing need that communities must plan for. Also, for the first time, the legislature made an actual change to one of the goals of the GMA, and they amended the housing goal to have a stricter standard than it had before. HB 1220 directs communities to allow middle housing in urban areas. And that when we talk about middle housing, it includes a range of types, but it includes duplexes, triplexes, and townhomes. And also to remove barriers to these housing types in development codes. It adds an equity requirement to consider the racially disparate impacts of housing policies and our codes, as I mentioned before, and also to address the potential for displacement that can be caused by new housing development. And we know that displacement disproportionately impacts households with low income and people of color. So understanding the racially disparate impacts and displacement is really important to understanding the equity of our decision making. So all of these updates need to be made in each community's comprehensive plan. And for Pierce County and our cities and towns, these updates to our comprehensive plan must be completed by December 2024. Housing is just one of about a dozen subjects that need to be updated in the Pierce County plan. And here in this presentation, I'll focus on housing. But in a few points, I will share with you sort of like the enormity of the types of changes that we need to make to our plan overall. So the new state also added some significant requirements for cities in the form of HB 1110, which also updated the Growth Management Act. HB 1110 only applies to cities over 25,000 people, but it does add more direction for how housing is to be included in their plans and policies. So the county isn't including changes related to HB 1110 in our planning because it's not required, but there are certain things that we'll talk about for our urban areas that will be more that could potentially change our urban areas to be more in line with the types of changes that are related to HB 1110. So HB 1110 not only affects housing plans and policies, but it affects zoning and development regulations as well. And some of the requirements of 1110 depend on the size of the jurisdiction. So, for example, one of the things that it requires is that more than one housing unit is allowed per lot if the lot's used for affordable housing. And the range of how many additional units have to be allowed on the lot ranges from 2 to 6 units, depending on the size of the city. And this is housing that must be secured for in affordability through something like a covenant or a deed restriction for at least 50 years. It also opens the door to increasing density in at least 75% of a community's single family areas, and requires allowing at least 6 different types of middle housing Now, I mentioned 3 types of middle housing in my presentation, but this new provision of GMA identifies 9 potential types of middle housing. It requires that design review, development standards, and environmental review can't be more restrictive for middle housing types than for detached single family. And it also gives an alternate process where the Department of Commerce may approve alternate actions that a city wants to take that may have the same effect as what's required. So if the city comes up with a very localized plan for improving affordability, it can prepare that and submit it to the Department of Commerce and say, in lieu of these specific things in 1110, we'd like to try this. There's a process for approving or conditioning those types of requests. So for HB 1110, these updates have to be included in communities' plans and regulations 6 months after the comprehensive plan updates are due. So that means June 2025. But because it's very well aligned with some of the changes that might need to be made with HB 1220, you'll see that some of this work is likely to be accomplished in community comprehensive plan updates, and then maybe some other parts will be finalized after the updates are completed. So keep your eye out on those changes within cities for HB 1110. I also wanted to note that in 2023, our legislature adopted a host of other bills with requirements that affect housing. These specifically address regulations, processes, and procedures. And for most jurisdictions, the types of things that these bills require don't have a strong policy tie-in. So they're less linked with changes that would be made during the comprehensive plan update. But because they're so interrelated with the changes that are required under HB 1220 and HB 1110, that jurisdictions may be processing them at the same time. So I just wanted to give you a heads up that here's some other things that might be part of or included with the thinking on comprehensive plan packages. And most definitely, the county is working on many of these things, either on the same track as the comprehensive plan or a parallel track to the comprehensive plan. And these include HB 1337, which requires the removal of specific obstacles to urban ADUs in the development code. It basically looks, when ADUs were first required to be included in land use elements, and required in urban areas, many communities adopted a variety of provisions to, I think, intended to make ADUs fit better into existing neighborhoods. But analysis has shown that some of these things are barriers, such as owner occupancy requirements, for example. So HB 1337 has a very specific list of obstacles that need to be removed from development codes if they're there. The county will be doing this work at the same time if it's comprehensive plan amendments, and it's integrated with our response to HB 1220 as well, which asks us to remove obstacles to affordable housing development. HB 1293 ensures predictable and objective design standards. The county is going to be working on this also in harmony with our HB 1220 updates, because we'll be looking at our policies as well as our regulations that might be viewed as obstacles to affordable housing. And then lastly, but not least, is Senate Bill 5290, which is about streamlining permitting times. Currently, Pierce County is working on this through a parallel process, looking at our permitting center and our the way the county does approves development, and that's called the workflow improvement process. It's a priority of the Planning Public Works director and department. So we're working on that on a parallel track but likely to be, we've already started making improvements and doing some pilot projects for improvements related to that, but we'll also likely be doing some code amendments related to that on a parallel track to our comp plan update. So a lot of our legislature has been doing a lot of thinking in the last couple of years about how we make it easier to create affordable housing in our communities. So the point of our conversation today is to talk about how we're meeting these requirements in our comprehensive plan updates. So I wanted to ensure that we all start with the same background and context. I know that we have a variety of backgrounds in this room here, or in our virtual room. And so I thought I'd be explaining about what a comprehensive plan actually is. So I alluded to this before, but in Washington state, most counties and their cities and towns are obligated by GMA to develop and maintain a comprehensive plan that guides growth for the next 20 years. So comprehensive plans are all required to address the topics in that required elements column: land use, housing, capital facilities, utilities, transportation, and climate. Climate was just added by the legislature in 2023. So while many communities had already, including Pierce County, had already planned to incorporate climate into our comprehensive plan updates, some of the specific requirements that are new as of 2023, we're not required to update those until 2029. So for Pierce County and for other communities, you'll probably see a partial update of the climate requirements, but we're actively going to be working on fulfilling those by our state deadline. There's also optional topics that can be addressed in a comprehensive plan. And while this is a list of optional elements that are listed in GMA, a community can actually adopt any or include a chapter or element on any subject that's of particular interest to that community. But those that are included as optional in GMA are mostly because the state has never appropriated funding to help local governments prepare these elements. So once a community adopts those elements of their plan, though, they are required to update and maintain them. So Pierce County does have an economic development and a parks and recreation element that fall into that category. We also have sub-area plans that fall into that category. We don't currently have a conservation or solar energy, but those are topics that are addressed in our plan, and they will be part of our climate update to our plan. So these are pretty major requirements. Every 10 years, communities have to update their comprehensive plans. So we plan for 20 years of growth, but we update it every 10 years to stay current. This year, it's going to be a major update, not just because of the changes that we're making for housing, but as you can see, we're also making a lot of changes for climate as well as other initiatives in the county. So what's Pierce County's process about? Well, we actually started working on our update in 2021. So we've been working on it for about 2 years straight. And when we started this, we wanted to have a framework about our process that would help to guide us as we're doing this work. A 3-year project is a really big project. It's hard to wrap your arms around it. To support the update of the policies in our comprehensive plan, we're also producing some other supporting documents, such as a capital facilities plan, updated critical area regulations, and we're preparing an environmental impact statement, or EIS, to help us better understand the impacts of our decisions. If we alter policies in any kind of a significant way, we'll also need to update the Pierce County Code so that our zoning and development regulations are consistent with the policy changes that we make in our plan as well. And this is going to involve the code updates that are needed to support housing diversity, and the code updates that I mentioned as part of some of those meeting consistency with the state requirements early in the presentation. So we see that we can use our update process to provide clear policies for decision making, to improve our county service delivery, and to make sure that we have compliance with GMA and other state laws. We also are hoping that it will help us to become more competitive for grants and funding as part of implementation. And we really wanted to make sure that in our process, we had goals to have good communication and coordination, that we were advancing equity, and that we were developing a defensible and compliant plan. So it's not only is the subject matter a tall order, but the county takes this update very, very seriously in terms of our project vision and objectives. So let's focus a little bit more on housing. To better understand, the changing landscape of housing, and to understand how what the housing needs are in our community, we started engaging our community in housing over a variety of issues. Pierce County conducted a general engagement period on housing and other topics for the whole month of September 2022. During this period, we had several methods of submitting written comment, and we received many, many written comments. We also conducted a survey, and we talked to people at 16 pop-up events throughout the community. What we learned from that is that, first of all, housing affordability was frequently mentioned during the engagement. Younger adults and lower income households especially reported the greatest struggles in finding housing they could afford. But in general, when we look at the results from our survey, others mentioned that while they may have had a place that was affordable, their housing didn't always meet their needs. And that was 37% of the people in our survey. So well over a third of the members of our community felt like their current housing isn't meeting their needs in some way. And we know from the discussions that we had that people wanted housing that was closer to work or other community amenities like shops, medical care, parks, or schools. And most of our respondents said that they would walk about a half mile if the places that they needed were closer to their home. So the other thing that came up a lot in our discussions with the community is homelessness. And homelessness is very clearly a very divisive issue in our community. People had all kinds of housing and non-housing solutions that they suggested, but we do know from evidence from Washington State Department of Commerce and our own needs assessment that many of the issues of homelessness are directly related to the affordability of housing. And so we plan to address homelessness not only through the county's comprehensive plan to end homelessness, but by addressing housing affordability in our comprehensive plan update. This summer, we also conducted a series of stakeholder interviews to better understand housing challenges based on racial or ethnic identity and patterns of displacement. We were trying to dig a little bit deeper into these questions of displacement and equity to understand how we can do better in our policies and our regulations to advance equity. So the engagement that we did has helped develop our scope of work for the plan update. And here's a little checkpoint where our primary scope of work for our update includes 67 areas of update, and that's across all those elements on a previous slide that we are updating in our comprehensive plan. After we identified our scope of work, the Pierce County Council also added 19 separate amendments for staff to consider. So it's a really big scope of work that we're looking at. But looking at our focus on housing, we have 6 areas. 5 areas are within our housing scope of work. So first, of course, we'll be promoting housing for all incomes with improvements related to HB 1220. We will be addressing issues of equity and displacement. We're going to be looking at the balance of jobs and housing in our community, as well as addressing issues such as aging in place and looking at climate change and how it interacts with housing. The last issue of tiny homes was added by the county council. And so we'll be looking at the county's approach to tiny homes. It's worth noting that although the language in this relates to tiny homes, the county actually doesn't really regulate on the basis of this term tiny homes. So we will be looking at a bit of a spectrum of things that tiny homes could cover in our work. So when we think about those 6 areas of update, all of our proposed policy changes and related code amendments will be analyzed through our environmental impact statement. So an environmental impact statement provides an in-depth if-then analysis. So in other words, if you take a particular action, how does it affect our environment and our systems? And for systems, we also mean our political systems in terms of, are we meeting the requirements that we need to make for regional and state policies, but also our social and community systems. So the ifs of the if-then action are what we call our alternatives, and the county is studying 3 alternatives. These use different approaches to land use and housing, transportation and capital facilities, and environment and climate. The then part of our if-then analysis helps us to understand how the policies that we set in those alternatives have different impacts and outcomes in the variety of areas, this whole colorful list of things that are shown on the right. It also, we're also doing some supplemental work on health and equity indicators that'll be integrated into the EIS. So the point of developing the alternatives is to provide us good information for decision making. We use the alternatives and the impacts analysis to better understand the pros and cons of different kinds of choices. And this allows our community and our decision makers to weigh and balance the different policy options to come up with what they think is the best way forward for Pierce County. So the 3 alternatives that we're studying include alternative 1, no action. We always study what happens if we don't take any action, but growth happens anyway. Then we have 2 what are called action alternatives. That's where we're looking at different policy alternatives. And in alternative 2, it's a series of incremental changes that are intended to bend the trend of growth to better support housing affordability, climate resiliency and mitigation, the efficient provision of services, and to ensure consistency with state and regional planning directives. But in all 3, it involves much bigger changes that might occur more rapidly. So we call that end the trend versus alternative 2, which is more incremental and trying to bend the trend. So we set those alternatives up to essentially be bookends. So what happens if we move a little more slowly and incrementally, and what happens if we try to make very, very big changes in a short timeline? From a housing policy perspective, alternative 2 and 3 look very similar because both require nearly a full overhaul of our existing housing element and policies. So the first thing that we need to do is in our housing element, which is our housing chapter of our comprehensive plan, is we inventory our existing housing and projected needs. That's going to replace our entire current context and background. The policies will be updated to reflect changes in GMA through House Bill 1220, and to a lesser extent, the other policy change, the other House bills and Senate bills that I discussed before, and will include planning for affordable housing, middle housing, and emergency housing. We're also adding policies to address racially disparate impacts, displacement, and exclusion. Our policies take on regional issues such as our jobs, housing balance, and climate change. And we're also integrating the locally important policies such as aging in place. And for these policy updates, like I said before, there's very little variation between alternatives because both Alternative 2 and Alternative 3 are designed from a policy level to address all of these issues. But that doesn't mean that we are including them exactly the same way in our conception of the alternatives. So as I presented at the last or a couple weeks ago, I presented on the county's growth targets and the housing in all policies tool. That's the tool that the Department of Commerce uses to assess what our community housing needs. So the difference we really have between Alternative 2 and an Alternative 3 is really how we distribute those housing needs across Pierce County's landscape. So both alternatives attempt to integrate that housing for all incomes according to the needs in the HAP tool and the county's growth targets. However, they look very different from a land use and transportation perspective, and this has a direct effect on where new housing might be built in the county. So I'm going to walk through these images that are on the slide. I generated these from the free Bing AI image generator. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm still experimenting with this resource, and I don't think that these images capture exactly what the vision is for the Pierce County landscape in either alternative. But I do think they capture something, an important essence in the difference between our land use approach, between our two action alternatives. And remember, these alternatives are intended to be bookends to look at how we distribute our growth and housing throughout our community. So in Alternative 2, it increases density modestly throughout most of our urban growth area. So most of the county's unincorporated urban area. And the idea is that we make modest increases that are supporting the development of middle housing, such as duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, and cottages. But it's a lot more of a peanut butter method, as I think, where we're spreading that growth throughout our urban area, as shown on the left. It also increases intensity across our single family areas, but the idea is to still keep the type of suburban character that Pierce County is known for. The county's current centers and corridors policy, which is our current policy that focuses new development around new higher intensity development that's more of a mid-rise approach. It focuses it around transit corridors. That would still be in place. So you don't really see that reflected in that image in the left. But we're still planning for those higher intensity transit corridors in future development. But Alternative 3 creates more of a substantial mid-rise core in the middle of the county's urban area. So it's centered around those current centers and corridors area, but it extends that development out from a few hundred feet to about a half a mile from the corridor to create a transit-oriented development area. So that's a little more like the figure on the right. And the idea is that we would use it to create a concentrated high capacity transit core. So this picture also doesn't reflect that within this core, it would be a more mixed use environment. So there would be commercial development, especially along the transit corridors. So that isn't really depicted here. But outside of this area of our high capacity transit core would be lower density development, like the county currently has, that single family homes, cottages, and duplexes. So it would be a lot more like today's landscape, but with a little more housing variety. Alternative 3 also supports a more coordinated approach to investing in multimodal transportation. And so these types of densities are intended to support higher frequency transit and to support more amenities within a half mile of the area where the county is going to grow the most. So as you remember, that half mile is the same distance people said that they would be willing to walk to get to amenities within their community. So this approach could decrease auto dependence, and decreasing auto dependence or the need to have a single family or a single occupancy vehicle or a family vehicle, or reducing household expenses, potentially investing in vehicles and transportation. It could reduce costs for some households. So the differences between these alternatives form a set of bookends, as I've mentioned before, and it's really about evaluating trade-offs. So here I've only touched on really the land use and housing variations between these alternatives and just a little bit on transportation. But there's other differences in the approaches between the alternatives when it comes to things like other transportation improvements, capital facilities, and climate responsiveness. I would encourage people who are interested in the differences between these alternatives or want to explore it a little bit more to go to the county's website, which I'll present at the end of this presentation, and take a look at the full list of differences between the alternatives. So, these are very different ways of going about growing the county over the next 20 years and have direct implications for housing. So we are at the place now where we are drafting our policy changes and preparing our draft environmental impact statement. We are going to release that for a public engagement period that's going to be 45 days. It's going to happen in winter 2024, so first thing in the new year. You can expect to see policy updates across the board, but of interest to this group specifically, housing policies and an assessment of those policies and these land use alternatives in our EIS. So that would be a great time to comment on the information that's there. We're going to have a very extensive materials available online. There'll be many opportunities to make written comments and also participate in community meetings where these items can be discussed. Moving on past that public engagement period, we're going to select a preferred alternative. So when we look at the alternatives 1, 2, and 3 in our draft environmental impact statement, we know that these are conceptual alternatives, and very likely what will happen is that we will get input from the public, and our county council will review these alternatives, and they will pick and choose policies and strategies from both alternative 2 and alternative 3 in order to create the best way forward for the county. And so that will set the direction for the creation of all of our final documents, including our policy documents, and then those related code updates. So that process of selecting the preferred alternative is going to happen in spring of 2024. There'll be a series of hearings at the Planning Commission where they will take some testimony, as well as the County Council. And then finally, we will, as we are preparing those final documents for review, that will happen in summer and fall of 2024. And those things, including housing policies and housing implementing codes, will go through our Planning Commission and on to the County Council for final document review, hopefully culminating in adoption of the update by the end of 2024. So still, even though we've been in this for 2 years, still a lot of work to be done. And public engagement is really important to our process. We are gearing up for some really important conversations, including conversations around housing. So if you want to stay updated on what's happening with our process, please go to our county website. You can see it here, piercecountywa.gov/comp plan. Here you can go and sign up. You can send us a message or ask questions. You can also sign up for email updates. So when we change things on our website or when we have a big comment period coming up, you'll get an email to let you know, pay attention now, we're doing something. I also encourage you to follow us on Pierce County social media. Here's some identifying information about that. We put a lot of information out on our social media during those engagement periods. The other thing is that when the county originally adopted its public engagement plan for the overall update, equitable outreach and engagement has been a really important part of our approach. And every time we go through a phase of engagement, and so far we've done, I mentioned two that were related to housing, but we've done also engagement based on critical areas and engagement based on climate. And so every time we do that engagement, we make a special approach and a plan just for that part of the engagement. It always includes, we're always trying to build relationships within the community and improve our outreach to those parts of our community that have been historically marginalized or underrepresented. So I know that in the work that many of you do, you may work with these communities. And so I would invite you to do a couple of things. One thing is if you have the ability to comment on behalf of communities that you serve during part of our process, we really welcome those comments. If you have the ability to work with us so that we can have direct conversations with communities that you work with, we would love to do that as well. So if you have the ability to do that, I would love to hear from you. I put this request out at the housing consortium event that was in January and got a great response. And some of the people that we were able to interview as part of our equity and displacement interviews this summer were people who I had great conversations with at that event. And so I encourage all of you, please reach out. We really do want to talk with you and make sure that our plans and our policies are representative of all the people in our community. So with that, I'm going to leave you here with my contact information. You can also contact me through the website and open it up for questions or comments.
Great, Erica. That was fantastic. We do have a couple of questions starting in the chat. First is going to be from Cynthia, and she would like to know whether the two options include assumptions that increases in regular transit routes, or if they only focus on development of more or less high capacity transit. In other words, given that transit is so limited now, will the plans include more regular transit in all neighborhoods?
Absolutely. So a couple of responses there. We have been coordinating closely with Pierce Transit throughout our process to try and think about the future of transit in our comprehensive plan and our updates. When we talk about high capacity transit in our high capacity transit area, that will mostly be served by bus rapid transit. And that also involves ongoing coordination with Pierce Transit to make that happen. So but in general, all of our alternatives, alternative 1, alternative 2, and alternative 3, they all involve this kind of coordination with Pierce Transit and looking at how we can best serve the entire community with transit. So while some of the alternatives may have a greater or lesser focus on high capacity transit, the idea is that not only would we be expanding options for transit in both of our action alternatives, but we would be expanding options for other multimodal transportation, such as bicycling or pedestrian access.
Perfect. We've got Carrie, would you like to take yourself off mute and ask your question? I just want to be able to ask it correctly, and I don't want to misinterpret what you're trying to ask.
I'm not sure which one you were referring to. Apologies for the construction noise in the background. I had asked one question about if this was being advertised at all to transit users, like heavily, just because I haven't seen anything yet and I ride pretty much every day.
Okay.
Sure. So we have to this point, we haven't done any specific advertisements on transit. It is something that we could consider as part of our big communications and outreach push for when we release our documents. It's something that we've thought of before. So it's definitely something that we're considered during our scoping process when we were doing pop-up locations in the community. Oftentimes, several of those pop-ups were located in areas that were adjacent to transit stops. And so I know I personally worked at a pop-up where we had a couple of staff both staffing a table, and then I was talking to people who were waiting for the bus and transit users in that way, which isn't as comprehensive, I think, as what you were suggesting, Carrie, but we have made some efforts to try and talk with transit riders in terms of that input that helped us develop our scope of work.
I would say don't leave out sound transit either, because we have a significant number of people in our county that regularly use that also. And then also Metro, like that Federal Way area where we're bordering right on the two. I would love to see more housing in Northeast Tacoma. No secret about that. In terms of spreading everything out, people should be able to live on the waterfront and other nice and peaceful and beautiful areas that so many of our community just don't have access to.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, sound transit for the county's comprehensive plan update, sound transit doesn't actually go through any of the areas that we have jurisdiction over. It goes through our cities and towns. So we do less coordination with sound transit, but I do appreciate the idea that sound transit is a good way to reach people who do live and work within our jurisdictions as well. So we'll keep that in mind. And I also think one thing to mention is that all of our cities and towns are doing these updates as well. So if you have a particular area of interest, such as North Tacoma, make sure that you're interacting with the city and talking about the issues that you care about with those cities as well. I do see a comment from, it looks like Jay Wright in the chat. Are there emissions outcomes forecasted with the different alternatives? That is, greenhouse gas emissions and air quality is one of the things that we are looking at in our EIS. So as part of the if-then analysis, it's if we take these actions, then how will they impact emissions? That's something that we will be looking at very closely.
Great. Yeah, I just had seen that as well. We've got a couple of other, couple of extra moments for some other questions or comments. Feel free to take yourself off of mute as well and just pop in and ask your question if you've got one. Like I said, we do have a couple more minutes. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Erica. I was curious about how growth was forecasted for these planning documents. Like what went into the forecasting the last time around, like maybe some like the data sources and like how close were we to those like predictions of how much the population would grow, and are we using anything different this time in our forecasting?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, so population forecasting is mostly done by the State Office of Financial Management, and they provide a county-wide forecast that has lower, moderate, and higher growth projection, and it gives us a range. So, communities are free to pick the range that they think is appropriate for their community. And I should say counties, when under growth management, it's the county that essentially picks the growth projection, and then we work in a process with our cities and towns to basically identify how much of that growth, kind of what a target is for how much each community will take of that growth projection. So I can't really speak to all of the sources that the Office of Financial Management uses, but I know that in part of the discussions, the county, and in cooperation with its cities and towns, looks at what looks like the best forecast. Pierce County has traditionally chosen something in that middle range of growth. Unfortunately, when we do these exercises, there's always something that pops up, right? So it's not as quite of a straightforward process. Like 10 years ago, I wasn't with the county, but I know they went through this process. 10 years ago, they made a projection for 20 years of growth. Now we're back 10 years later. It seems like it would be straightforward to say, like, are we, above or below that trend of growth? But then we look back and we're like, well, there was COVID, and that really changed patterns of growth during that time. When we look back, at the previous 10 years, we're like, well, there was a major recession that really affected growth trends. So part of the process of doing our updates is that we are constantly, like, we have these checkpoints where we make adjustments. The other thing that the county does is it prepares a buildable lands analysis, and it says, how much did we grow and in which areas did we grow, including our cities and towns, over the last decade or so? And was that in line with our expectations of how growth should happen? We do use that input to help shape not only our county-wide planning policies, but also the policies in our local comprehensive plan. And in terms of housing, the Department of Commerce has added a new 5-year check-in or not the Department of Commerce, it was added by the legislature, but in 5 years, we will need to do an update that we submit to the Department of Commerce that says, how successful have we been in the last 5 years at meeting the housing needs and the housing targets that were set by income level for that we planned around. So it's a process with a lot of checkpoints where we're looking at our information and balancing and rebalancing and trying to make adjustments to improve our plans over time.
Do we have any other lingering questions? Well, if we do not, I guess that's going to wrap it up. Erica, that was great. And lots of good questions too. Thank you guys for bringing solid questions, and I think it really is. I think this is great. I wanted to give a little bit of an update. I'm not sure. Byron messaged me in the chat and said that the link for the YouTube might be a little wonky. So if that's not working for you, just hold a second and I'll send everybody that's in the meeting today. I'll send you guys an email following up, and I'll give you the direct link to this. And then that'll also take you to the other videos if you'd like to watch those as well. So yeah, our next Lunch and Learn is going to be Thursday, November 9th, again from 12 to 1. It's going to be a follow-up to the very first Lunch and Learn that we did in this series, where we were joined by Lakewood and Burt Consulting. So this time is going to be Tiffany Spear from Lakewood. She's going to give a deeper update about Lakewood's comprehensive plan update, their housing allocation targets, and their equity index map. So feel free to join us for that again. Yeah, and you can sign up for our newsletter on our website as always. And then we've got Erica's email in the chat as well. And I will be following up with as many of the resources and links as that were discussed as I can. So I appreciate you guys. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much, Erika.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.